August 12th, 30 BC, Alexandria. A woman sits in a palace chamber, dressed in gold and purple. Two servants stand beside her. One holds a basket of figs. In 10 minutes, all three will be dead. But this isn't a story about how Cleopatra died. It's about the 10 days before, when the man who would become Rome's first emperor used isolation, false promises, and one unspoken threat to dismantle her piece by piece. No torture, no violence, no execution. Just a Roman who understood that breaking a queen was more valuable than killing her. The weapon that finally destroyed her wasn't an army or a blade. It was her son. And the most disturbing part isn't what happened in that chamber. It's how methodically Octavian made sure she had no other choice. August 1st, 30 BC. 10 days earlier, Alexandria's harbor was burning. 12 months before, Cleopatra and Mark Antony had assembled the largest naval force the Mediterranean had ever seen. Over 500 warships, legions from a dozen kingdoms, everything staked on one battle. They lost at Actium, off the coast of Greece. Their fleet shattered, not in hours, but in minutes. Ships rammed and burning, commanders abandoning formation, Antony's flagship pursuing Cleopatra's retreat while his navy died behind him. The alliance collapsed immediately. Kings who had sworn loyalty withdrew their troops overnight. Roman senators who had supported Antony sent letters to Octavian pledging allegiance. Gold meant for soldiers disappeared into private vaults. By the time Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt, their army existed only on paper. A year later, Octavian's legion stood outside Alexandria. Inside the city, betrayals accelerated. Antony's cavalry defected first, riding out to Octavian's camp in full formation, switching sides without a single casualty. Then his infantry, and then his remaining ships, which sailed out of the harbor and surrendered their weapons before a battle even began. The palace, which once held audiences with kings and philosophers, became a place of locked doors and whispered panic. Officials fled. Servants vanished. Guards abandoned their posts. Antony moved through empty corridors, shouting orders to soldiers who were no longer there. Cleopatra made a different calculation. She retreated into her mausoleum, a massive stone structure she had built years earlier. Designed as both tomb and fortress, the building had one entrance, 3-foot-thick walls, no windows. Inside, she gathered her most valuable possessions, gold, jewels, incense, ebony, centuries of accumulated treasure from the Ptolemaic dynasty. Then she sealed the doors from inside. Her plan, if it was a plan, remains unclear. Ancient sources suggest she intended to burn everything, denying Octavian both wealth and trophy. Others claim she hoped to negotiate from a position of strength, using the treasure as leverage. What she did next changed everything. She sent a messenger to Antony with a single piece of information. She was dead. Whether this was strategy, desperation, or something else, the effect was immediate. Antony, already unraveling, accepted the news without question. He ordered his slave to kill him. The slave refused and killed himself instead. Antony took his own sword, drove it into his stomach, fell, but he didn't die. The wound was fatal but slow. He lay bleeding on the floor of his chamber when the truth arrived. Cleopatra was alive inside her mausoleum. What happened next is documented by Plutarch in detail that feels almost surgical. Antony's body was carried to the mausoleum. The entrance was sealed. Cleopatra refused to open it, not from cruelty, but from calculation. Opening the door meant losing her only fortification. Instead, ropes were lowered from an upper window. Antony's dying body was hauled up the exterior wall. Cleopatra and her two attendants pulled him through the window themselves, dragging a Roman general up stone walls while he bled. He died in her arms inside the tomb. By the time his body stopped moving, Cleopatra was completely alone. No army, no allies, no kingdom, and Octavian was already inside the city, planning what to do with her. What Octavian does next is one of history's most calculated mind games ever recorded. This is where it gets disturbing. Octavian didn't want Cleopatra dead. Dead queens don't parade. For over a decade, Octavian had fought a civil war against other Romans, against Antony, against the Senate, against anyone who challenged his consolidation of power. Publicly, he needed to transform that internal conflict into something else. A living Cleopatra walking through Rome in chains would do exactly that. She would become proof that Rome had defeated a foreign threat, not butchered its own citizens. The civil war would be rewritten as a defensive victory against an Egyptian queen who had seduced and corrupted Roman men. Cleopatra's fall wasn't the result of military might or betrayal alone. It was the result of a masterful psychological campaign, a series of isolated moves that left her with no choices. Octavian understood that a broken queen would be far more effective than a dead one. He used the one weapon she couldn't fight against, her love for Antony and her desire to save her son. By exploiting her emotional isolation, Octavian turned Cleopatra's own desires into her ultimate downfall. The psychological toll of her last days was far more harrowing than any battle or siege. Octavian's subtle manipulation was the true weapon that destroyed Cleopatra. And in the end, it wasn't her army, her people, or even the mighty forces of Rome that made her fall. It was her own mind, caught in a trap she couldn't escape. The propaganda was already prepared, but Octavian also understood the risks. Cleopatra had spent 20 years navigating Roman politics. She had allied with Julius Caesar, borne his child, survived his assassination, and rebuilt her power by aligning with Antony. She spoke 9 languages, commanded fleets, negotiated with kings. If given any opportunity, she would destroy herself and everything she controlled, denying Octavian both treasure and spectacle. So he moved with precision. He didn't storm the mausoleum. Instead, he sent a lieutenant named Gas Proculus, someone Antony had once trusted, whose name might carry weight. Proculus approached the sealed entrance and called out, speaking calmly, making vague assurances about negotiation and safety. While Cleopatra was distracted at the door, other soldiers climbed the same wall where Antony's body had been pulled up. They entered through the upper window, moving silently through the interior. Cleopatra realized what was happening moments too late. Ancient sources disagree on exactly what she did next. Plutarch claimed she grabbed a dagger. Cassius Dio suggests poison. Either way, she was subdued before she could finish. She was not harmed. No bruises, no chains, no violence. She was simply transferred from the mausoleum to the palace, now a prisoner, not a queen. The rooms she was given were luxurious, the same chambers she had occupied before. She kept her servants. Her meals were prepared as before. Her belongings remained intact, but every door was watched. Every servant was searched upon entering and leaving. Every meal was inspected before it reached her. Her personal items were examined daily for anything that could be used as a weapon or poison. A guard was stationed outside her chambers with one specific order. She must not die. This wasn't mercy. It wasn't even cruelty. It was logistics. Octavian needed Cleopatra alive and intact for his triumph in Rome. The public procession where conquered enemies were displayed before execution. He needed her recognizable, walking, unable to claim she had been tortured or broken. But he also needed her compliant. And that required a different approach than force. Octavian visited Cleopatra 3 days after her capture. No record exists of their exact words, but what remains is the structure of what happened next. He entered her chambers without guards, a calculated gesture, and sat across from her, speaking in measured tones about possibilities and futures. He made no explicit threats. He made no concrete promises. Ancient sources described the conversation as almost courteous. Cassius records that Octavian listened to her speak about Julius Caesar, about her children, about Egypt's value as a stable province rather than a chaotic territory. He responded with vague assurances, mentioning that cooperation might influence how her children were treated, suggesting that arrangements could be made, but never committing to anything specific. That ambiguity was the mechanism. Cleopatra, trained in negotiation, tried to find leverage. She presented detailed inventories of Egypt's royal treasury, offered to cooperate in transitioning power smoothly, emphasized her children's ability to maintain stability. Octavian took notes, thanked her for the information, then left. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. Brief visits, polite conversations, questions about treasure locations, palace operations, and loyalty among Egyptian officials. Cleopatra provided answers, believing each piece of cooperation bought negotiating space. What she didn't realize was that Octavian wasn't negotiating. He was cataloging. Every detail she provided about Egypt's wealth went directly to his officials for seizure. Every name she mentioned of loyal supporters was investigated and neutralized. Every piece of information became a tool for dismantling what remained of her kingdom. Meanwhile, her isolation deepened. No visitors were allowed except at Octavian's discretion. No messages came from outside the palace. No news reached her about what was happening in Alexandria, in Egypt, or in the wider world. She existed in a bubble of managed information, where the only voice she heard was Octavian's, and he told her only what served his purpose. Then Cleopatra made her own move. She stopped eating. The servants noticed first. Meals returned untouched. She grew visibly thinner, weaker. Within days, she developed a fever. It wasn't a hunger strike in the modern sense. There were no demands attached. It was simpler. If she died from illness or refusal, it would deny Octavian his triumph just as surely as poison. The guards reported it immediately. Octavian's response was swift and specific. He didn't force-feed her. He didn't threaten her. He didn't raise his voice. According to Cassius Dio, he simply clarified the situation. You will die, but not until I've had my triumph. You will be seen alive and at my mercy. In that moment, Octavian knew that Cleopatra's final act would not be one of resistance, but of capitulation. Her death would not be a final defiance, but an acceptance of the inevitable. She would be paraded through the streets of Rome, broken but alive, her grandeur reduced to a spectacle. And this, in Octavian's mind, was the ultimate victory. Cleopatra, once the queen of Egypt, had been dismantled piece by piece. Not by military conquest, but by psychological warfare. She had been caught in a web of isolation, false promises, and a slow, crushing reality where her fate was sealed before she ever had a chance to act. And when she finally did act, it was too late. The game had already been won by Octavian. As Cleopatra's mind and body weakened, Octavian's grip tightened. The queen who had once commanded empires, who had negotiated with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, was reduced to a pawn in a far larger game. In the end, her death would not be her own, but Octavian's, his victory, his spectacle, his narrative. The queen of Egypt would never again rule a kingdom, but her story would live on, forever remembered as the victim of a political maneuver far more complex and devastating than any battlefield could offer. Her children were in his custody. If she harmed herself, they would suffer consequences. The text doesn't specify what those consequences would be. It didn't need to. Cleopatra resumed eating that same day. Now the trap was complete. Death meant her children would die. Compliance meant humiliation, imprisonment, and eventual execution in Rome. Silence meant waiting in uncertainty while Octavian consolidated everything she had built. She had no moves left except one, but she didn't know it yet because she didn't know about her son. Cleopatra had 4 children, 3 with Mark Antony, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. They were 10, and 6 years old. Royal blood, but politically manageable. Octavian could control their futures, raise them as Romans, marry them strategically, and neutralize their claims. They weren't the problem. The problem was Caesarion, 17 years old, son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. Biologically his son, not adopted. His full name was Ptolemy Caesar Filius Caesar. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, his will named his great-nephew Octavian as his adopted son and heir. That adoption gave Octavian his name, his political legitimacy, his entire claim to power. But adoption required will and documentation. Biology required nothing. As long as Caesarion lived, Octavian's position was vulnerable. Not immediately. Caesarion was young, foreign, and without an army. But futures are built over decades. Rome could tolerate many rivals. It could not tolerate a living son of Caesar who might someday challenge an adopted one. Cleopatra had understood this since Actium. After their naval defeat, before returning to Alexandria, she had made arrangements. Caesarion was sent east toward the Red Sea with tutors and guards. The plan was India, far enough from Rome to be irrelevant, rich enough to build a new life. His survival became her only goal. Everything else, the treasure negotiations, the conversations with Octavian, the cooperation, was theater. It was buying time, keeping attention on her while her son disappeared into distance and obscurity. Then the message came. The details are recorded by Plutarch with unusual specificity. Caesarion had reached the Red Sea. Ships were prepared. He was days away from leaving Egypt entirely. His tutor, a man named Rhodon, convinced him to return. The reasoning, according to ancient sources, was that Octavian had sent word he intended to make Caesarion king of Egypt, that cooperation would be rewarded, that the son of Caesar had nothing to fear from Caesar's heir. Caesarion believed him. He turned back toward Alexandria. Whether Rhodon was bribed, threatened, or simply opportunistic remains unclear. What matters is the outcome. Caesarion returned to a city now controlled by Octavian's forces. The news reached Cleopatra inside her monitored palace chambers. No ancient source records her immediate reaction. What follows is the interpretation of historians reconstructing events from documented consequences. She stopped asking about her other children. She stopped providing information about Egypt's treasury. She stopped engaging in Octavian's careful conversations about cooperation and future arrangements. According to Plutarch, she requested only one thing: permission to visit Mark Antony's tomb. Octavian granted it, likely believing it was a sign of surrender, of acceptance, a woman mourning her lover before accepting her fate. But Cleopatra understood something he didn't yet realize she knew. Her son was already dead. No negotiation would change it. No cooperation would save him. Octavian could afford clemency for her daughters and younger sons. They were children, controllable, politically useful. Caesarion was different. He was Caesar's blood. As long as he breathed, he was a threat. And Octavian had spent years eliminating threats with surgical precision. The psychological war was over. Cleopatra had lost. Now, she focused on the only victory still available. August 12th, 30 BC. Cleopatra woke in her palace chambers, bathed and dressed in full royal regalia, gold, purple, the formal clothing of Egyptian pharaohs. She requested permission to visit Antony's tomb. The guards, following Octavian's orders to allow reasonable requests agreed. She went alone, except for 2 attendants. At the tomb, she performed the proper rituals, poured libations, spoke to Antony's memory. Not romantically, according to Plutarch's account, but practically, telling him she would join him soon, that their enemies had won everything except their final surrender. She returned to the palace, ordered a meal, specific items, figs, bread, wine. Music. While she ate, she wrote a letter. The letter was sealed and given to a servant with instructions to deliver it to Octavian immediately. Then Cleopatra sent away all servants except her 2 closest attendants, Iris and Charmian, women who had served her for decades. The 3 of them remained in the sealed chamber. Music. What happened next is constructed from aftermath, not observation. Sometime in the afternoon, Octavian's guards became suspicious. The chamber, music, had been silent too long. The servant who delivered the letter had looked distressed. Octavian opened the letter. It contained one request, that Cleopatra be buried beside Mark Antony. He understood immediately. Guards were sent running to her chambers. They pounded on the doors, demanding entry. When they finally broke through, they found 3 bodies. Cleopatra lay on a golden couch, dressed in full royal regalia, dead. Iris lay on the floor beside her, also dead. Charmian was barely alive, using her last moments of consciousness to straighten Cleopatra's crown, adjusting it so it sat properly. One of the Roman guards, furious, music demanded, "Was this well done?" Charmian answered. And these words are recorded by multiple ancient sources, suggesting they were witnessed and remembered. It was well done and fitting for a princess descended of so many kings. Then she died. The actual method of death remains uncertain. Ancient sources suggest poison, possibly an asp hidden in the basket of figs, possibly a vial concealed in a hairpin or jewelry, possibly something else entirely. Modern scholars note that asp venom works slowly and causes visible convulsions. 3 women dying simultaneously and peacefully suggests a different poison, possibly extracted from plants, compounds Cleopatra would have had access to in the palace. The mechanism matters less than the outcome. Cleopatra was 39 years old. Music. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years. She had survived Julius Caesar's assassination, a civil war, multiple political purges, and the collapse of her kingdom. She died on her own terms in royal clothing, surrounded by loyal servants. Octavian had conquered everything she built, but she denied him the one thing he needed most, her alive and broken in his triumph. Octavian was, according to Cassius Dio, genuinely furious. Not because Cleopatra was dead enemies stopped causing problems, but because she had chosen when and how. He had spent 10 days carefully constructing music, her surrender, managed her isolation, controlled her information, used her children as leverage, creating a scenario where her only logical choice was cooperation. Music. She had found the one gap he couldn't seal. Still, Octavian was practical. He honored, music, her request. Cleopatra was buried beside Mark Antony with full ceremonial rites. Her body was prepared according to Egyptian tradition. The tomb was sealed properly. Music. This wasn't sentimentality. It was optics, demonstrating that he respected traditions, that he was merciful to defeated enemies, that Rome was a civilizing force. Then he finished what he had started. Caesarion's fate is recorded in a single line by Plutarch. Caesarion was sent by his mother with much music, treasure through Ethiopia to India, but Rhodon, his tutor, music, persuaded him to go back for that Caesar designed to make him king. Caesar, however, put him to death. No trial, no public execution, no ceremony, just the efficient removal of a political problem. Cleopatra's other 3 children were sent to Rome, raised by Octavian's sister. The twins eventually married into Roman families. Ptolemy Philadelphus disappears from the historical record, likely having died young from illness. Egypt became a Roman province, not a senatorial province governed by Roman nobility, but Octavian's personal territory. The grain supply, the wealth, all directed to consolidating his power. Within 3 years, Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. He won everything. The civil wars ended. The republic transformed into empire. His rivals were eliminated. His power became absolute. Everything except one thing, Cleopatra's final surrender. Cleopatra's death wasn't romance. It wasn't weakness. It was the last available move in a game where every other option had been systematically removed. When Octavian stripped away her kingdom, her allies, her freedom, and her son, he left her with one remaining form of control: how her story would end. She chose a golden couch and royal regalia over chains and humiliation in Rome. Octavian conquered Egypt, but he never broke her. And the most disturbing part of her final 10 days isn't what she did in that chamber. It's how methodically he made sure she had no other choice.